My name is Sarah Smith. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a professor of history at American River College, and today's date is August 30th, 2023. So let's start off by establishing the basics. What's your full name? What are your pronouns? And what's your date of birth?
So my name's Samantha Williams. I go by Sam, and the pronouns that I go by are she and they. And I didn't really catch the other
The
one.
date of birth.
And I was born in July of 1988.
Does that make you 35?
Yes.
Okay, so tell me a little about yourself. What are your interests and hobbies? What do you like to do?
Um, so I am a philosophy major right now. I was focused on more on the humanities, and my hobbies are gardening and taking care of my dog. And right now I have an internship through the California State Legislature, and I really want to pursue that to help with different social justices and hopefully change different laws and public policy.
Are there particular social injustices that you're active around, interested in rectifying?
I really want to focus on workers' rights and employment, just because of my own injustices with that. I I was basically sexually harassed and discriminated and retaliated against by my employer that I was with for 12 years.
Oh wow, I'm sorry that happened.
It's okay.
Um, so I think we're going to talk a little bit more about work life later.
Yeah.
So where did you grow up and where do you live now?
So I was born and raised in Sacramento, and I'm still in Sacramento. It's kind of hard to leave. It's like it's quiet, but it's not too quiet here. And the city life, like in the Bay Area, is a little bit too much for me. But a rural area is like way too quiet as well. So it's kind of like this nice suburban city life that is really hard to leave.
Have you lived in the Bay Area?
I lived there a couple months, and just the traffic um, and just the, I guess, the lack of jobs that I was at the time, I wasn't able to find. And but the people out there very progressive, and I like that. I wish Sacramento was a little bit more like that in that aspect. But as far as like traffic and stuff, I kind of get anxiety with too many people around me.
And I lived in Oakland for 15 years or so, and it was also more visibly queer.
Yeah.
That's what I noticed, the difference between Oakland and Sacramento.
Oh yeah.
So where do you currently attend college and what do you study?
So I'm attending college at Sac City College most of the time. Taken like a class here and there at the other Los Rios campuses, but I've primarily taken classes at Sac City College, and I really, I guess I don't know where to like. I haven't really known where to focus on. Like I'm gonna be graduating with basically like 6 degrees under my belt, but I've been focused on humanities and like social sciences. Um, the reason for that is because honestly, growing up, I hated people. And one thing that I will say that's kind of a little funny, like, I don't know if whoever's watching this is gonna, if they've ever watched King of the Hill. but there's a character on there, the kid Bobby, and his dad's being really ignorant to something, and he says, "Dad, uh, why do you hate what you don't understand?" And that really hit me deep because I really got angry with people because I didn't understand them at all. And then growing up, being told what to do rather than think for myself, it kind of created some problems with that.
Um, and so did you say you studied philosophy?
Yes.
Okay. And how did you come to philosophy specifically?
Um, I liked the fact that there wasn't really a definitive right or a definitive wrong. There was like a lot of, um, seeing people's different like their perspectives, um, and I liked that because I really have a hard time with taking tests and having one answer be right, but then I overthink about something. And with philosophy, I can go into depth why I chose my answer versus this is the answer A, B, or C. And in philosophy, there really isn't that, and it's more open, and I really appreciate that a lot.
Were there any particular classes or professors that kind of made you consider philosophy as a major?
Um, well, I had a teacher. It was a while ago because I've been at Sac City for a while, but recently, um, I had a teacher here, Matthew Howery. I think that's how you say his name. And I told him about how I wanted to pursue law, and he gave me some tips on, that philosophy is a really good subject to study, especially if you're going to take the LSAT, and like understanding logic. And I did have an interest in philosophy when I first started going to Sac City, but um, I wasn't ready because I didn't have that. What is it? I don't know if it's like a cognitive understanding or just an understanding of how to think for myself. Um, it just being told what to do for so long, and then going into logic, and or just even like trying to explain something and argue about something, that was really hard for me, like because even though when I was growing up, like I was always told, like even though I knew something, I was right about something, I was just always told to just, that was just to deal with it. um, and so I've had a hard time with like taking communication classes, and philosophy because I didn't know how to think for myself, and it's taken some time for me to really adjust and be more comfortable with that.
Is there a particular kind of philosophy you're interested in?
Ethics. I want to focus on ethics.
Okay, and are you a full-time student or a part-time student?
Currently I'm part-time.
Why is that?
Just because I'm almost done with my classes to transfer. I only have a couple of classes left.
And when did you start? How long have you been at community college?
So I've been at community college for about, it's going to be 15 years this year. And it is mostly because I was working graveyard shifts during the first part, and it was really hard for me to take classes that were in the daytime. because those were the classes that I needed. And so it's like, you're giving a schedule and you only have a couple classes that are for that specific course. And so for me, I thought, okay, well, I'll go to work and then go straight to school. And that was just a lesson I had to learn. That wasn't the right thing to do. But yeah, I've been here for 15 years. In the back of my mind, I always think of my grandfather always pushing me to keep going with my education. That was one thing that he really thought was important, and I could understand why. He had to deal with a lot of issues around that. It's kind of why he was drafted into the Korean War, because he didn't have enough units when he was going to college, and so he really pushed me to pursue my higher education, and yeah.
So can you tell me about how you identify with regard to your social identities, broadly speaking? So race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, disabilities, religion, and so on?
Okay, so I identify as Japanese and white. My mother is Japanese and my dad is white. And I also identify as genderqueer and queer for gender and sexuality. And what was the other question?
So wait, you said your mother's side was your mother was Japanese and your father was white.
Yeah.
Queer, genderqueer.
Yeah.
Disabilities, religion, and class.
Okay, so I've been diagnosed with CPTSD and PMDD, and I'm currently agnostic. My family's Buddhist. Yeah.
Okay, so what does it mean to you to be queer with regard to your sexual orientation?
I guess, could you explain that question?
Yeah, so sort of personally, what does it mean to you to be queer with regard to your sexual orientation? Like, what does that mean? I guess in reality, like not in like day to day, like in terms of your sexual and romantic attraction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for explaining that. So I actually thought of my sexuality, like who I was interested in, as a burden for the longest time. Just because growing up, I had friends that just unfriended me because they found out I was gay. So I just, I just tuck that away usually when I'm meeting strangers. I'm not really open about it too much unless I get to know somebody. Yeah, so I'm just open with my family and my friends, just because I'm not really sure like how somebody's going to react to me being queer, and who knows, like if somebody becomes physically violent just because you said you identify as something.
Is there anything else you want to say about that? About what it means to you, like being queer? Like you said, use the word gay as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. I guess the way I kind of throw the word gay out there as like a universal way sometimes of saying queer. I know that's incorrect, but it kind of slips out. But I feel like I'm more comfortable now, now that I have a partner, and my family accepts me a little bit more. It's easier to accept myself. Um, but there's always a part of me that um, that's kind of proud to be queer because just it can be liberating at times to be different, to have people that are in your community that you can relate to and not feel like you're judged in that community. I think that's really something I'm proud of with the with what's gone on in the last, I would say, 5 years. Um, you know, I think seeing people be really excited about, watching the new episode of RuPaul's Drag Race and having straight friends be really into that as well. I think that's really cool, like how things have progressed in that way. Because, I would say maybe 15 years ago, there was probably like one channel logo that like you could watch all your queer, stuff, and it wasn't, you had to have a subscription for that or satellite or whatever. And now like there's more queer stuff, um, queer content in the media, and in like on public television. And I think that's really great. So that's something I think that I'm proud of, being part of the community.
Yeah, I think when I was a kid and a teenager, there was next to nothing
Yeah.
on TV, and it's so different now. So you identify as genderqueer. Can you elaborate? So what does that mean with regard to your gender identity and expression?
So I identify as genderqueer. It took me a while to actually to find my identity with that, because I honestly thought I was going to transition. Um, I think growing up with misogyny um, really made things confusing because, um, the men were acknowledged more, they were treated better. I wanted a piece of that pie, and I just identified more masculine. So, when it came to um, me growing up, and I finally got boobs as like a little kid, and I used to run around topless all the time, and then eventually got to an age where my mother's like, you can't run around with your shirt off. And I'm like, why not? Because the boys are doing it too, and I wish I had that privilege. And so I being masculine, being more into boy stuff. I guess I resonated more with being like a guy. Um, but there was like a moment when I was trying to explore possibly transitioning, and just kind of sitting with myself and saying, am I going to be okay with this surgery? Um, and I started to have a meltdown, and I realized, that I wasn't ready for something like that. That's something really drastic for me to do. And it was just a part of me knowing that I didn't accept myself. Um, I felt like I had to change something about me in order to be accepted. And there's also feminine qualities of me that I don't want to erase. So for me, doing research about like different genders, and I resonated more with genderqueer, just because it's kind of like a broad term, and I don't have to say I'm this or that, because I don't really feel like it's really important, I think for an example, I went to a private school when I was a kid, and we had these coloring papers, and one they were teddy bears. One was a boy, one was a girl, and I was asked, well, which one did you want? And I said I want the boy one, and it was always like that. Like when I went to like fast food restaurants, and they're like boy toy or girl toy, a boy toy. So that, I guess that was kind of like reflecting on that. I guess that's where I saw where I was more masculine as well.
Is there anything else you want to say about that, about identifying as genderqueer? Like, where did you find that term, I guess? How did you come to understand that was a term that could apply to you?
So I actually was just searching like on Google, like randomly, and I just kept Googling like questions, and there was a bunch of like forums and blogs talking about being genderqueer, and there were some people that said that's two spirited, and I didn't really understand that, and I don't know if that's correct, but I resonated with genderqueer because it was just a broader term. And when somebody was describing how they felt through one of the blogs, it was just like I swear we had the same story, and that's where I kind of came to terms with that term, and then looking into that term, and then that's where I identify.
So you use she, them pronouns. Can you explain why it's important for you to use both she and they?
So like I said before, like I identify that, I guess, more of like a social acceptance thing, because some people are ignorant to pronouns. So that's why I do she, they. I would prefer they, but not everybody is going to say they. I do respect it when people do universally just say they. But I pretty much identify with she, just for the people that have a hard time with pronouns.
Other people I've interviewed have said something similar to that.
Yeah.
How does that make you feel, I guess, to kind of use she as well as they when you prefer they? Like, does that make you feel a certain way? I don't know.
I think it kind of reminds me of like the reason why I don't share that I'm queer to people. Just the whole thing of being scared you're gonna be treated differently. Like, oh, you're liberal. Oh, you're super progressive, and I don't want to be categorized in anything, and I think I really try to avoid it. I don't like the labels, and I try not to put myself out there to have those labels created on me.
And you're concerned about hostility?
Yeah. Like I said, with identifying as queer, like I'm scared that somebody's not going to accept it and retaliate against me just for being myself, and that's always in the back of my mind when it comes to talking about my personal life. I mean, I was working at a place for 12 years, and I would say 7 years in, and nobody knew that I was queer because I didn't share that part of myself. It wasn't until my partner started working there that everybody kind of found out about that. But like I just kind of keep things more of a secret. I think just to avoid confrontation.
Do you feel like that can distance you from people? Like distance you from forming closer relationships with people?
I think it really has made um, made it harder to socialize with others, and to really get to know other people because I only give a small piece of myself, and when you put a little piece of yourself, you're only going to get a little piece of something else. And if you don't put your whole self in there, then you're not going. Then it's not going to turn out the way you would like it. And I personally like to socialize, like especially with my friends. I think some of my friends will say, Sam, you can talk for hours and not stop, but that's with people that I feel comfortable with. And then when it comes to people that I don't know, I'm very short and just give like short responses because, like I said, I don't know how they are, and it takes me, a couple times talking to somebody sometimes to really open up.
Is there something deeper there? Like, what's that reticence to be more fully out to people, or to kind of guard yourself in that way?
I think that with my family, I think they were scared that I was going to get hurt for being gay, and I think that fear um, was kind of placed there when they mentioned it because when I was in high school, um, I came out and I tried to start a queer straight alliance at my high school, and one thing that my mom had said was she didn't want me getting hurt, and I didn't really understand that, and so I did it anyway because I didn't understand it, but I really wanted to do that. And so it turned out okay, but I think, not being in high school anymore, I've, I would say an example, I went to the movies one time, drive-in movies, and I had just gotten a new car and I didn't know how to set the alarm and everything, and it went off mid-movie, and some guy yelled and called me a faggot, and that's where that that feeling of like, whoa, this is kind of a crazy like reaction, and it made me kind of scared because he got really loud, and it was just over a simple mistake. Um, I think also like friends not wanting to be my friend anymore because I mentioned who I liked. So that made it fearful for me to even be myself fully with people, like right off the bat.
So, under what circumstances do you share that you use she and they pronouns?
I usually use she and they when I'm in the classroom setting, um, just because I don't really know how the teacher is going to be. I mean, our school district's supposed to be pretty open and accepting of students of all all categories. Um, but I have ran into some professors that didn't, acknowledge somebody being trans and calling them by their birth name versus the name that they
Adopted?
yeah. um, so their name that they preferred wasn't accepted by that teacher, and so I think that was an example of, those are problems that I could run into, and I really want to just avoid those problems. So I guess putting myself into a category where I could go either way. um, that's the reason of using it in that setting. When it comes to a work setting, I use she and they. But when it comes to me being with my friends and my family, it's they. Yeah.
Um, so can you talk some about your coming out experience? What was the process like of figuring out your identity, and how did the people around you respond?
Um, so when I was younger, I noticed that I had attraction for girls, um, but I didn't really understand it because growing up, being raised by my grandparents, and they were Japanese, um, I think that they didn't really understand queer people. I think they really depended on the news and media for information, and they developed this thought that queer gay people um, were dirty, that they had AIDS, and so when I was younger, I was like, I'm not either of those. I don't have AIDS. I'm not dirty. And so that stuck in my head because the way they described it wasn't who I was. But it, it was difficult because I did have little crushes on some of my friends, and I didn't understand it. And I think um, having childhood neglect didn't help that either because I would feel so strongly, and I didn't know what that feeling was because I felt that connection with somebody, and I didn't know if it was really sexual or if it was just like a friendship that like I just longed for, and um, I think when it came to middle school, I kind of started thinking that, but when it came to high school, it wasn't until randomly freshman year, some girl like just walked up to me and gave me a kiss on the cheek, and then I was like, okay, I think I know now. But I it took me like sophomore year to come out to my mom, but it was kind of forced because I was friends with somebody, and I ended up developing feelings for my friend, and I shared those feelings on paper. For some reason, she kept those letters and stuffed it in a book, and her mother found it, and her mother faxed my mom the letters, and and so and then she left a voicemail telling my mom, "Hey, I faxed you these papers just to make sure she got those." And that day, my mom and I had a conversation in the car, and the first question she said was, "Are you gay?" And I said, "I'm bi," but that's what I identified back then. And she just told me that, she doesn't have a problem with it, and that she used to have a gay friend. I think that's like the classic, oh, I have a gay friend. Uh, um, and it just felt good to like be open with my mom about something, and she didn't really care. She actually thought that my friend's mom was crazy. So that was really nice that, my mom kind of took my side with that. But yeah, that was my coming out with my family. And then with my grandparents, I told them later on, and they told me that they loved me no matter what. but it, growing up though, I have younger siblings. Um, so my brother, he's 21. My sister's 18. So I'm definitely older than them. And when I was in high school and even after high school, my mom didn't want to share with them about me being queer. So that was really confusing for me because she accepted me, but she didn't accept me. Like it was so explicit to be that. I get it; it's a sexuality. It's something that you're into, but so is a straight relationship as well. And my mom's kissing my stepdad, so I don't see the difference in it. But for like how my family treated it, it was like a double standard.
Yeah, discussing being or talking about being gay is not the same thing as sharing gay pornography.
Yeah, right.
Um, so anything else you want to say about your coming out experience?
Um,
Wait, how old were you when your mom found out?
I was 14.
14. And
Yeah.
were you really nervous when? I mean, I guess it was sprung on you when you were having this conversation. She was like, are you gay?
Yeah.
So you didn't have that much lead up to, it's not like you were thinking for weeks, days and weeks about coming out to her but was it something that you wanted to keep from her? And then, because you were concerned about how she would respond, I guess?
Um, I would say I kept it from her because I already had, you know, problems growing up, trying to connect with my mom. So, that's the last thing I want to do is have her not accept me. Um, so, I think that, um, just wanting to be special to my parent, and I didn't want to sabotage that. So I think that's why I kind of kept it to myself. And also, I wasn't really sure exactly, at that time, because I liked both boys and girls, and I, was still exploring it. So I didn't want to be, this is my definitive sexuality, and that's it. And I wasn't comfortable and confident with that yet. So being thrown out there like that was really, I think it was kind of fucked up. But, you know, um, it played out the way it did with my friend's mom.
And then what happened with your friend?
I wasn't allowed to see her again. I was told that to avoid her. Her mother requested for me to not interact with her or talk to her anymore. But, looking back at it, she was a hypocrite because she was an alcoholic that became very physical with her child. And so I was like, is being queer worse than being abusive to your child? And that's where it was really confusing right there. Because I felt like I was made to be the villain in that. And really I was just trying to express some type of love towards somebody. And for somebody to come in and tell me that I'm a bad person, and that I would, basically, um, impose my sexuality onto her child. Why is her child even saving those letters in the first place? I don't know. That's something that I think about time to time. Just how malicious she was. I know it's far back, but I reflect about other things that have happened in my life. Just I don't know, just to kind of see where I am mentally with things, and it doesn't bug me as much anymore, when I go over it. But it does suck that it had to come down to that.
So what about your high school experience? You said you formed a QSA.
Yeah.
What was that like? You found other students and you formed a QSA?
Yes. So well, there wasn't really much queer related stuff on campus, and I really wanted to start something because it's basically when I started like being more open and coming out in high school, and I realized that there really wasn't a area for queer students to really like come and hang out, and even if it was just for pizza or something, we just having a group that you can go to and know that you're not alone. That's just great in itself, right? and and we ended up like having a teacher, bringing her daughter in that was trans, and she spoke about her story, and it opened up my eyes about like the surgeries that are involved and how intense they are, and I could not imagine going through that. And just like even allies, there's a lot of allies at my school, and that made me feel a little more comfortable because when there would be kids that would tear down our flyers for meetings or events, those allies would chase those people down and say, "Hey, what you're doing is really fucked up, right?" And that felt good because it's like somebody has your back. One thing I ran into as a conflict, though, was a person that was announcing the days and times for the club meetings. I think they did it like every Monday or something. And one girl, she skipped over my meeting, and my ROTC teacher that I had, he came up to me and he said, "Didn't you have a meeting on Friday?" I said, "Yeah, I did, but for some reason they skipped over it." And he said, "That's not acceptable." So he went to the office, and the girl basically told him that she doesn't believe in, queerness and all this. And he's like, "It doesn't matter. It's a club, and you need to announce it. That's your job." And that made me feel great to have a teacher, especially with the military background, stand up for me. Having teachers stand up for me for my club was really great because I didn't have that at home. It was like an outlet for me to embrace that and not feel like I'm being punished for being queer, and that and even
Curious, sorry to interrupt, was the ROTC teacher, what gender were they?
a male, yeah. And I didn't really think of. I was actually kind of scared of my ROTC teacher a little bit, and I didn't really think that he was accepting of gay people like that. But when I came out and I was trying to start that, he offered to be one of our mentors for our club if we didn't have somebody to what is it?
Like your advisor.
Advisor, there you go. And it was awesome because he actually came out to me saying that his sister identified as a lesbian, and that he you know, he's accepting of it, and that when anybody's ever been aggressive towards his sister, he always stands up for his sister, and that for me made the environment safer for me, especially when I really wanted to get into like the military at one point. Um, I think I wanted to do that because he inspired me so much with all the support he had for me.
And what happened around the military?
So I couldn't get into the military because of my mental disability. And it really sucked because, um, just having that record of being disabled or having some type of psychiatric treatment since I was 13, like it's like a label again, it's like, hey, you have an emotional disability and we can't have you. And that kind of sucked because I was physically ready. I knew what to expect, but it was just having that background of that. Like it just sucks because it's like you're being told, hey, I know you went through your childhood traumas and everything, but yeah, you're not qualified for this. And I had to really like just adapt to that. And then I just pursued trying to go to college after that, which I would say when I did get into a university, I had to drop out a couple months in because I wanted a party because I was really sheltered. So, yeah.
Did you say where you went to high school?
I went to high school at John F. Kennedy. That's in Sacramento here.
So growing up, did your family have any expectations around femininity and masculinity that you had to navigate?
So I definitely was expected to be a girl. I was always called a tomboy, and my grandmother, for sure. She every time we went out and I was dressed in a skirt or whatever for a memorial service at the Buddhist church, I'll sit down with my legs open, and she said, "You need to close your legs." I would, but at one point I said, "No, I don't want to." um, and it's funny because after that, and not like really caring anymore, I would just lounge around with my legs open, and it was kind of my rebellious way of saying, "F you!" Like, I'm gonna do whatever the hell I want, and guys get to do it, so why can't I? So I think it was, for me, I got to an age, I think, let's say maybe like 9 or 10, where I just didn't care anymore, and I did whatever I wanted to. But I still got the comments, "Oh, that's not ladylike," and I would say, "I don't care." And I think that sometimes I was maybe considered kind of a bad kid in that aspect because I didn't listen. But at the same time, I didn't get to be who I am. So that part of me kind of came out with that. And she would buy me stuff with flowers on it, and I was like, this is really feminine. I don't want to wear it. So like a lot of the feminine clothes that I would get, they would be like pushed to the back of my drawers, or in the closet or whatever. And I really avoid like wearing like feminine type of clothes. I preferred like unisex um, clothes just because um, I didn't feel like it was like the focal point of being too boyish or too girly.
So you mentioned that your mom's side of the family is Japanese and your dad's side is white. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences growing up biracial?
So growing up biracial, um, I think it wasn't like too bad until I think my mom and my stepdad got married, because my stepdad's Chinese and my mom's Japanese. So when they had their their children, which is my my brother and sister, um, they're they look like a happy family, and I just kind of looked like this white kid that was randomly like in this family. I think like being asked, "Oh, who are you?" Um, definitely made me feel like I wasn't really a part of, and I didn't really experience too much awkwardness growing up, other than like um, going to predominantly white schools and bringing for lunch like a musubi, like rice and seaweed. And these kids are like, ew, seaweed. But I'm pretty sure 20 years later, they're eating sushi at a restaurant now. So I think like I was a little insecure about the food part, but when I got older into high school, middle school, I really did start feeling like I was different. I started feeling like I wasn't really a part of, um, especially like having to hide my sexuality from my siblings. Like, why am I hiding this part of myself when I really straight up don't feel like I'm a part of at all? And I think it made me really angry inside. Um, I had some anger issues growing up, and I did notice that whenever it came to like discipline, um, I would get, I think, more aggressive than a normal teenager would, just because I was already going through stuff. And how dare you like punish me for something when I'm already going through all this stuff? And that was my thinking back then. And when it came to um, you know like middle school, and I was living with my mom more. I think it was middle school and high school. I started living with my mom more, and before that, I was living with my grandparents. Um, I I remember specifically middle school. I was dropped off by my stepdad, and I was thinking, this is a big transition from elementary school to middle school. And I see everybody's parents going with them, and he's like, "Good luck," and then drives off, and I just didn't feel supported at that point. I felt scared, and I felt like I was just being thrown into something. And I think being like at the first day and everybody having their parents next to them like made me feel like an outsider. And then I was I felt like I had like a lot of restrictions. I was told to do a lot of chores around the house, um, gar- gardening work, like mowing the lawn. edging the grass, cutting the shrubs, pretty much child labor. While my stepdad or mom were inside, doing whatever. And so I didn't really feel like I was valued, really. Um, and I think when it came down to like me walking home from school, like in the dark, I think that's when teachers started like asking me, like, "Do you ever ride home?" And I'm like, "No." And I always wanted to stay later. I would stay like an hour or two later after school got out because I didn't want to go home. And then it got to a point where, I was going home and, I was forgetting to, when I was cooking, I would forget to turn off the stove, and I got my key taken away, and so I was told to stay out in the backyard. Um, so I pretty much pissed and shit out there if I needed to, like a dog, and that was my punishment for that. And so I kind of felt like I wasn't a bad kid, but I was being treated as if I was. and and then when it came to high school, um, I had to learn how to take the bus system, and I learned how to do that. I learned how to navigate on my own, and there was like times where it was late, because the bus didn't run that late, and then I have to catch another bus, and I would get punished for that. And I didn't really feel like that was fair because I wasn't allowed to have a car because they didn't trust me when it came to um, being really into going into the mall, and I know back then it was like when Daffy turned into Spencer's. I don't know. Okay, so it's basically Spencer's now, and they sell like cheap jewelry, like sterling silver jewelry. And I decided, because I'm a teenager, I thought having a pot leaf ring was so cool, and so my mom came into my room one day and she saw that and she said, "What, do you smoke pot or something?" And I was like, "No." And she was like, "I don't believe you." And then I got drug tested and I came out clean because I didn't smoke weed. It wasn't until later on that I did it because it was already expected of me. And so having that perception that's like of you that's not really true, and just having to basically deal with them like not trusting me, even though I don't think I did things to really break their trust. I mean, there's teenagers lie about little white lies and stuff, but it wasn't that bad. Like, I never got arrested. I never really did drugs other than like try weed for that one time. I stole my grandpa's cigarettes, um, but I felt like that was an outlet for me because I was so stressed out. Um, just not feeling accepted in that way. I'm not feeling a part of a family. And I think that's where I kind of learned too how to detach myself and not not have to be myself around certain people and be myself around people that I felt comfortable with. And so I developed this, I would say, like a double life where my family thought I was, you know, doing stuff when really I was doing these other things. So, um, I think that things kind of like when my siblings got older, and I was in my 20s, and I started seeing like how they were being treated, and I just noticed that they were treated way better, and so I kind of felt like I got the shit end of the stick with that, and I didn't know if it was because um, I was different. But one thing I will say, and I will never forget, is when I was 13, and my mother and I had gone into a fight, and I just told her that I just want you to love me. And she told me that she could never love me the same way as my brother and sister because of my father. And it felt like I was being punished for the things that my father did. And whenever I got angry, that's who she saw was my dad. And so it's like I can't really do anything about that. I was born that way. Um, but I felt like had this punishment because she saw him in me, and that's one thing I actually strive not to be, is not be like him.
Was he around at all?
He was around until I was about 8, and then my mom took me away because he wasn't taking care of me when he would have me on the weekends, because they divorced when I was 6, and my my mom had full custody, but she wanted me to have time with my dad, and he just wasn't doing my laundry. He wasn't feeding me like he should. I was pretty much vomiting a lot because I was eating too much, and I just felt like that was an outlet for me too back then. Like there's a bunch of junk food at his mom's house where he lived, and for a kid like that's 8 or something, and you see boxes of candy just on the table, and you're like, go ahead, of course I'm gonna go get it, right? And so I developed like those unhealthy eating habits there too, and so that's why my mom decided, probably best that you don't see your dad anymore. He's not really taking care of you. And and he blamed me for stuff too. So he wasn't really that right in the head as well. And then when I was 10, he had committed suicide. I know that the story was that he's been schizophrenic. He had been schizophrenic for a few years, and definitely drug induced. He did a lot of cocaine and stuff, and so part of that story was he got really upset with his dad, and he shot him in the leg, and he um, got really upset and at himself and went into the bathroom and shot himself in the head. And so yeah, that's the story that I know. And so yeah.
And did you find out at the time when you were 10 when that happened?
No, I was actually told that he died in a car accident, And it wasn't until that conversation with my mom, when she told me that she couldn't love me the same, all that came out. Your dad really didn't get in a car accident. He actually killed himself. Like, that was just all that to a blow, like saying you don't love me the same. Your dad didn't really die this way. Like, that's really traumatizing to a 13-year-old. And I could just feel the resentments. That wasn't really my fault.
So you said you grew up partially with your grandparents.
Yeah.
Okay, on your mom's side, right?
Yeah.
So can you talk about the experience sort of growing up among your Japanese American grandparents, and like, did you experience any discrimination for being Japanese American, and um, you know, did they tell you about their experiences of discrimination, that sort of thing?
So my grandparents, so my grandpa, he experienced the internment camp, and my grandmother experienced World War II in Japan. Um, and so growing up, um, they would tell me a lot about what they went through. And I think for me, it was humbling hearing that because it made me appreciate, like, just having a turkey sandwich, um, the little things in life and how much they went through and lost everything. Like, I couldn't even imagine going through that. I think it was just traumatizing listening to them. And one experience that my grandfather told me was when he was in internment camps, that they would have 100-pound sacks of rice, and they would it was so hot in Tule Lake that there would be maggots in the rice, and they would cook it anyway because that's all they had, you know. And when he got out, they lost everything. You know, it was him and his sister and his mother living in a studio apartment, and he was working, um, you know, barely middle school, and him and his sister are working to like make ends meet. And he'd tell me, there'd be days, a lot of days, where he would have lettuce and mustard sandwiches because they can't afford anything else. And that's where I was saying I could appreciate a turkey sandwich now because, I couldn't even imagine that. My grandmother told me that she had to bury everything, all their valuables in the ground because they didn't know if, what was going to happen next, and when, all that stuff was going on in Japan during World War II. So, she said that a lot of stuff got ruined, and some stuff they couldn't find. So she pretty much lost a lot of stuff too. And she ended up marrying a guy in the army. And he ended up being an alcoholic that was very abusive towards her. And then she eventually got out of that marriage, and then found my grandfather. And so growing up with them, it was very, I would say, classic American family. My grandfather had a trucking business, and my grandmother stayed at home. And I don't know, there was just that expectation of her being a good housewife and him, working long hours to support them. And so I learned how to do chores at a really early age, and learned how to, make my bed and everything at an early age. So felt like I was kind of a little adult, like taking care of my space and being mindful of things around me. I think one thing though, growing up, especially with my grandmother, is there was a lot of shame put on me. And I talk about it with my mom sometimes, that, there's a lot of shame in our culture, especially with women. We're, taught that, we need to um, just have like basically be obedient, you know, um, do what you're supposed to, don't question it, don't cause any, dishonor to the family, or else you're going to get shunned and nobody's going to support you, and that sucks. So there was a lot of fear, I guess, that was instilled into me, because what I thought was my support system was really like something that was making me scared of being myself. I didn't understand it at the time. And then like realizing too that they, being the American family they are, despite like them having to lose a part of their identity, I didn't really understand that until like now as an adult, that they really did have to erase their identity of being Japanese. And I think that's why, I don't really know much except like the bad words that my grandfather would tell me. And, certain terms, but, I think seeing too that he was a Republican, that he hung out with racist white men, really was confusing for me. And they would insult like people of color, and I didn't understand that. I was like, Grandpa, you're Japanese, but you don't like black people. I'm like, or you're saying stuff about Mexican people. Like, why are you saying that? Like, because he was darker complected. So it seemed like a double standard. And I think one thing that was, I guess, taught to me in that point is not being yourself and adapting to what's around you, but not in the best way. And so it's like I really had to break free from that type of thinking, because I wouldn't be who I am today, if I kept following the rules and their expectations, and having others really accept me. Yeah, I get it with the pronouns. I do that a little bit, and I can see the type of fear that goes along with it, but it's not at the point where I've lost a part of me at that, I think I'm proud to be, Japanese and white, but I feel like there's a price to pay with being in an Asian background, because when it came to like classes, like communication, it was really difficult. I had to actually drop my classes because I just knew I wasn't ready, or I'd have a panic attack when it came to like, oh, this is your time to argue. You're going to go back and forth. I'm like, I don't want to do that, because it was creating so much anxiety of like, how am I going to defend myself? I can't even defend myself at home without being told I'm wrong. what makes you think that I have a good argument. And I think that was an insecurity of mine when I was taking classes and I would drop them. Like, what is it? Philosophy, logic, and critical reasoning, um, communication, argumentation, debate. Those were the two classes that I really avoided toward till the end now, because I just wasn't confident in in defending like my perspective or my answers, because I would just kind of go with what other people said just to make things easier.
So how do you think being Japanese and white kind of shape your experiences as somebody who's queer as well?
Um, well, growing up in my household, there really wasn't any queer people, and there wasn't like a lot of a lot of Asian people around me that were queer. So it felt kind of off because it definitely like made me feel like I'm just by myself in this category. Um, and then it wasn't until I went to an event at UC Davis with their queer clubs that they had. There was like one that was like geared towards Asian queers and Black queer, and then they all like came together and did an event together. And I thought it was really cool that they had like subcategories of clubs because you can be queer, but like I I'm not gonna um, relate to somebody that's from a different cultural background sometimes. So that can be difficult in itself. Um, I think when I do come across people that are queer and Asian, like I get excited because I can share those those things that hold you back. Um, like you could be open, but there's also that part of your family that's not really like a common thing that's around them. Um, so I think they've really had to adapt to that because they're not really used to having somebody in their family that's queer. And I think when I came out too, like my uncle, he would make a lot of lesbian jokes, and you know, he did it for fun, and I get it, but I guess for me, I don't identify as a lesbian, so it's like I don't know who you're talking to over here. uh, can't relate, but yeah, I think that he thought maybe because he went to college in the Bay Area, he lived in the Bay Area, like he thought it was cool, like to joke about it, but I'm like, you don't really know much about me either. um,
Okay, is there anything else you want to say about your experiences growing up biracial and growing up in a Japanese family?
I don't have anything.
Okay, so the next section talks about disability. You mentioned that you have CPTSD and PMDD. How do they impact you on a kind of a daily basis, and like how do they impact your education?
So with my CPTSD, that I didn't get diagnosed with that until like recently, within the last couple of years. I was actually diagnosed with bipolar, but that for my doctor, he really thought that wasn't a really proper diagnosis for me. Um, and I was telling him that I had like symptoms of like ADHD, with like concentration, like focus issues. Um, a lot of call it, disassociating a lot, anger episodes, um, and you know, like with the triggers, like I wouldn't realize how to get really, really snappy with people, like really angry, um, and just kind of seeing red. You know, get road rage, and I just didn't understand like why I got so upset. Um, and explaining that to my doctor, you know, it's where that diagnosis kind of came from, and it's impacted me with that because you know I'm in class um, and I'm trying to focus, but you know it's like watching the Peanuts and the teacher could go wah 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 wah, and that's pretty much what I'm getting. Even though I'm focusing on them talking. I'm being attentive, but I'm not being attentive at the same time. It's just like my brain just shuts off. Um, One thing I did have issues with because of my workplace, and I did develop some PTSD with that, was um, having an escape plan. Um, I was basically buried waist high in boxes, like a lot, to where I couldn't leave at my job, and it would create so much anxiety because I'm like, well, if there's a fire, I would be stuck here, or I would have to climb out. And so when it came to going to class, I really avoided going to class because I didn't know where I was going to sit. I guess I would try to go there early, but sometimes the seats that I wanted were taken. I mostly wanted to have a seat close to the door because I could leave, and I knew I could leave if I needed to. I did get questioned, or not really questioned, but a comment was said by a teacher, um, you know, basically just telling the whole class, like, I prefer you guys to come to the front um, to, you know, sit rather than in the back. And the teacher saw me in the back and was like, you know, are you able to come to the front? And it just kind of felt like it's unintentional, but at the same time, she didn't understand what I was going through. And that made it really difficult because I'm not going to say, hey, I have PTSD of like feeling like if I had like a trigger, I'm where I feel like I can't escape, like I'm I'm gonna have like a panic attack, and you know, having that in the back of my mind, I think that kind of makes things a little fuzzy with my concentration too, because I have to think about being comfortable, and feeling comfortable in a class is really hard to do for me. I've had to get special privileges to have like arranged seating, like tables that I can adjust, or you know, with an office chair, or whatever that they have in some classrooms for accommodations, and that's helped. But I was really, honestly, needing that when I first came here because the desks were like really uncomfortable. They hurt my back. I do have kyphosis in my back, which is like abnormal, like curvature, kind of like scoliosis. And so, like, that's in the back of my mind sometimes, like how uncomfortable I am with my back. And so, thinking about these things while I'm in class, I'm like, there's no room for me to think about the content of what's being taught to me unless I'm really feeling comfortable that day. And that's why I really avoid going into classroom settings and do online classes, because I don't have to think about all that. I could just hop out of bed and feel comfortable in what I'm wearing and the seating or whatever, and not have to think about those things. And then with my PMDD, that got brought up when I was diagnosed with CPTSD, because of my mood swings, and my hormone changes, a couple weeks prior to my period. And it really makes me fatigue. Like it's like feeling tired, but like saying like you're tired and you just took a Benadryl on top of that. Like, I'm really tired. And so when I'm feeling like that, that's hard to concentrate too. And then like feeling like I'm gonna pass out in class because I'm so tired, because I'm so fatigued. So that's like some really discouraging stuff that happens like with my classes, and that's why, like I said, I prefer online, because with some of the online classes, you can go back at the video and rewatch it if, like, let's just say I wasn't feeling good that day, you know. So there's a lot more flexibility with that, and and like I said, I didn't really take advantage of the accommodations as much when I first started coming here. I think it was mostly because I didn't want to be labeled as disabled and like different. I think that was an insecurity of mine. And like it's nice that the school provides it, but like when it came to telling my teacher, and there's the note taking by a peer student, that's awkward to have to go up to somebody and say, "Hey, can you take notes while I'm taking notes," or whatever. And I had teachers, be pretty cool about it, but I had a teacher that wasn't, and he was like, I'm not gonna ask the classroom if they can take notes for you, because I shouldn't have to force that upon anybody. And so that made me feel a certain kind of way, because I felt like I was being punished for being disabled in a weird way. Like, hey, like, I need help, but I'm not going to impose something on somebody to help you. That's pretty much what it was like saying to me. So I think after that experience, I didn't want to take advantage of that accommodation, because it felt like a hassle. It felt like a burden. And then with the video recording too, like, some teachers don't like that. Some teachers prefer not to be recorded. So that accommodation kind of gets kind of murky, and yeah. So I think one thing that's really helped me with my focus is having better seating, because I don't have to think about being uncomfortable. Like, it eliminates like one thing versus feeling uncomfortable altogether and not like being able to learn anything.
So is there anything in particular you would like professors to know with regard to how they should kind of accommodate you and your disabilities, and like students in general? How they could accommodate students with disabilities better in general?
So, in the beginning of the semester, we get the syllabus and it says if you need help from, with a disability, whatever, there's DSPS. And like, that's cool and everything, but sometimes people are insecure about having some type of issue where they need to get accommodations. And I really honestly wish that like if professors were to like say, hey, if there's anybody that's comfortable staying after class that needs help with the disability services and any accommodations, I'd like to talk to you so I could better understand what I need to do or accommodate while in the classroom rather than waiting for that note from DSPS that just says, this is accommodation, this is accommodation, this is accommodation. I think having somebody understand what your symptom, like you don't have to, but having that professor kind of understand how you learn what's going to be best for you, I think that'd be a really good way of approaching it. I don't think it's really outing somebody saying, hey, after class, but they could always say, oh, email me and then maybe we can talk through Zoom. I think that some type of approach like that would be really great because, like I said, I felt like I was a burden to some of the professors because I felt like, I gotta like, ask somebody for you or, having proctor testing, going to a different room, that feels weird altogether too. And I had a teacher though that she would set up the proctor testing prior to the test day, and so it wasn't weird saying, hey, so whoever needs to do proctor testing, you could go ahead and go in the room. That to me is kind of outing somebody about having a disability versus, let me set up a time for you to take it on a different day. So it's not really as noticeable to like other students if that person's not comfortable. So I thought that approach was good, like from that teacher.
So can you think of ways that being queer kind of shapes your experience of being disabled and vice versa? Like, how do you think the two parts of your identity relate to each other?
I think how they relate to each other is I hate labels. And I think having that disability label on you sucks. I think being categorized in some type of sexuality kind of sucks. Like, why can't we just be ourselves? Why can't, people just accept that people are just different? I think that's where, for me, it kind of comes together. I felt insecure about being queer, I've been insecure about feeling disabled, and I've had it put in my face. And those are two things that I shouldn't have to feel ashamed of. Rather, I should feel like it's just a part of my identity. It's just a way of how I learn things or how I deal with things. And I think that, when I approach things, like, I really try not to assume, like people are of a certain ethnicity or a sexuality or whatever, because honestly, like, being assumed that I'm white, like, I didn't really spend much time with my white side of the family, so I didn't really understand. I'm like, well, no, I'm biracial, but I identify more Japanese. but I don't look like that. And so for people assuming stuff like that, people assuming that I'm straight or whatever, I'm just like, why does there have to be assumptions about those types of labels? Like, um, and I think I really try to push the boundaries sometimes with that. I think like um, like being just being myself, and then when somebody assumes something, I don't I don't have to. I don't know. I just laugh it off now rather than get so upset about it anymore. I think it's just funny how people just stereotype people or assume things, and they're like they don't know anything about you. Um, and so I feel like my approach of that has changed over the years. But before, I felt like I was doing the same thing as other people. Like, you're lesbian or you're gay, whatever, and really somebody doesn't have to if they have a feminine voice or whatever. I was just really ignorant to that. So I think educating myself with that and living it has really put things in perspective. How they're much alike of being queer and disabled is having those labels and people assuming stuff or putting a label on for you rather than yourself.
Is there anything else you want to say on the topic of disability? I mean, it might come up later, but is there anything else you want to say right now on that topic?
I don't think right now.
Do you feel empowered as somebody who identifies as disabled?
I don't really feel empowered. But I feel empowered, like accepting where I'm at. Um, I don't know if that makes sense, but like I'm accepting of that. I don't focus all that much, or I kind of daydream or whatever, and I have mood swings sometimes, but I don't I don't feel bad for it. I've had to adapt with it. And I wouldn't say like, "Hey, I'm gonna put a patch on my shirt saying, hey, I have CPTSD and I'm proud of it." But I can say that um, I guess I'm glad to have the experience that I can, so I can help other people that do have those issues. I can be more empathetic towards people that have those issues, and I can help people. Because that's the only way I think I can accept that. Because if I didn't, I would be really resentful and angry that I don't have a purpose for it. So that's where I guess I put that purpose in having that experience and being able to share that with others and be compassionate towards others going through the same thing.
Yeah, well, I think that question is a hard one to answer. It's also kind of complicated, right? Because you can feel empowered in some ways and then disempowered in other ways, or maybe the word doesn't even apply.
Yeah,
but,
yeah, like empowered. I'm not sure, but yeah.
Well, like self-awareness and is a form of empowerment. Like advocating for accommodations is a form of empowerment. Thinking that faculty like should know better, should have some knowledge, should accommodate students, right? Have some kind of understanding of their students as complex human beings who, you know, like you shouldn't make assumptions about, right? That's I don't know, that's a form of like being empowered a little bit.
Yeah.
um,
I think like the professors that I've had in the last semesters, like they're a little bit younger, and I really appreciate the the way they've approached like when I've had a problem. You know, when I've talked to teachers about like when I was going through stuff with my job, and saying that sometimes my brain kind of just shuts off and it's really hard to do the homework, and I do have the intention of like finishing it, but like some days it's just tough luck, Sam. Your brain's not on the education mode right now. And just having teachers that just take the time to listen to what you're going through, and then asking like, hey, what's up? Like, I've noticed that you haven't been turning these assignments in. Like, that makes me feel like my teacher cares about me, just those little things. And not just thinking that somebody's just not turning in their stuff because, and like I said, like the newer teachers, like they ask about my pronouns or anybody's pronouns at the beginning of the semester, and I'm not used to that, and it's kind of cool. And one of my professors, like, she said that she identifies she and they, but she's not really part of you know of any type of, I guess, special gender identity. She's, but she's accepting of that, and she even said, I think they is just a universal word, so I'm just gonna say I'm she they. So, and I guess for me that resonated with me too, because, but at the same time, I wanted to be accepted as well. So.
So I do want to ask about class a little bit, economic class, and then talk more about education. So can you just talk a little bit about, your class background and your current class status? What's that like?
Um, like middle class, low class, working class. Okay. So my family, I would say, was like middle to low middle working class. Um, and I think that had to do with my grandpa and his business that he had. But like my mom, when she remarried, her husband, was making a good amount every year, and so we weren't really like uncomfortable, but at the same time, there it was, because my stepdad didn't like, using the AC or, the heater or whatever. And he was very cheap about stuff. And my mom was like, I want to feel comfortable. And she was like, I'm going to pay the bills. But then it would create a dent in her account because she's not making that much compared to him. And so, seeing that, and like seeing where she was prior to that, she was a single mom, raising me and her, but she was never there. So I mostly stayed with my grandparents, and then they supported me. And I had stability financially, I guess, but I think there was a part of me that was scared to ask for things because I was told like, oh, that's not a necessity, that's a luxury item. And and so I think that like takes that plays a part in for me now is like when I buy stuff, like I want to buy stuff that I need, but it's hard for me to buy things that give me pleasure too, um, because there's like some weird like part of me that talks me out of it, and it sounds like my grandma. um, and then like feeling like I don't deserve certain things too. So I mean, even though I was financially okay with my family, like there was a part of me that didn't want to ask much because of their backgrounds with money, how they kind of struggled prior to being where they were at. And it made me feel like I should just ask for things that I just need. And I felt like I couldn't really be a kid.
So we left off talking about your family's class background. Can you talk about your personal class background and sort of how you get by?
So I would say I'm more lower class, um, just because I've been supporting myself on a part-time job for the longest time. I don't really have a full-time job. Well, the internship's pretty full-time, but um, I've I haven't been able to have a full-time job, just just because it's hard doing that when you're going to school. Um, but I definitely have had a lot of financial struggles, and I don't think I would have gotten through them if it wasn't for me living with my partner. Um, because rent's really expensive right now, especially in Sacramento. And, you know, having like a good chunk of your paychecks going to just rent itself is really stressful. And, um, and then after I had gotten hurt from my job that I was with for about 12 years, um, I was on workers' comp and I was getting paid way less than I was. And then I started really feeling the impact of feeling financially insecure. And it was the first time I ever applied for, a, I guess, what do you say, for assistance?
Government assistance.
Government assistance, yes. Um, and I got, I was, I was qualified for a lot of stuff at that point, and it really made me like think about the benefits of being kind of poor and being like in the in between where you can't really afford stuff, but you kind of can. And so experiencing that, I'm like, well, what's the point of making more money when the benefits are better when you are poor? So that was like really interesting because I worked so hard at my job to establish insurance. And then I end up being like barely financially able, and then I just got insurance. And I'm not saying that it's like a wonderland of, having government assistance, but I guess if I knew about that, I wouldn't have like put myself through so much suffering with my job, and it would have gone through a different job and had the same government assistance. And yeah, so I don't think like after I graduated from high school, I was pretty much on my own. There was a time where I was staying at my grandpa's, but I moved out onto one of his properties, but I was independent and, you know, paying my bills and everything. So from a young age, I've pretty much been on my own. And I really try not to ask for assistance from my family, um, just because I felt like there was an expectation that was like tied to it. So there's always like a string attached to something. So that's where I've really worked on my independence financially.
So have financial stressors ever made it difficult to attend classes, or have your work hours made it difficult to attend classes?
Working, my work hours have kind of made it difficult, especially like being an evening worker. Um, you know, when you're working evenings, like it's like a weird time because, you know, especially with the job that I had, it was really physical. Your body doesn't wind down until like an hour or two after. And by that time, for me, it was like 2 a.m. And so I had a hard time taking morning classes, but I didn't want to take like late afternoon classes because that was just too close to when my shift started. And that like would stress me out. So I thought that made it a little difficult for me taking classes. And that's why I also took online classes for the most part because that flexibility was nice. I think, like, I'm not going to say the pandemic was great and all, but I will say for the availability of online classes, it was great. It was great for that. And I wish that there was more stuff like that that was available for online classes. And I know not everything uh, can be switched to that. I took an art class during the pandemic, art theory or color theory, and that was really difficult because if you're taking an online class, you can't see the colors, right? Right? I can see that's where the exception falls under. Um, and then having your teacher say, "Hey, it should be this shade," and then you're like, "It is that shade," and then you're having to like retake pictures to prove that, and it's like a really pain in the butt for that.
I can imagine. Um, so I think I'm just going to transition for the sake of time because I know we've been asking you a lot of questions.
Okay.
Can you talk some about your experiences taking classes that either wholly or in part focus on queer and trans topics?
Um, so the only class that I've really taken that was queer related was human sexuality, and that just kind of covered like some basics, but I haven't taken any gender studies classes. Um, just because I was trying to figure out what I wanted to pursue as a major. Knew it lied in the humanities part, but I think that I didn't want to focus too much on the queer studies part because I don't know, like I already have that issue with labels and and I maybe there's an ignorance to it too, but I I guess I didn't prioritize it um, because I'm like, well, why am I going to take a class for queer studies when I'm already living life as a queer?
Well, I mean, the question is,
I
there aren't that many classes that actually focus on queer topics.
yeah.
Like I think at SCC right now, there's maybe one class, LGBTQ lit, and I'm not sure that's offered all the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
So your human sexuality class, that just sort of kind of provided some kind of like introductory material about what it means to be LGBTQ.
pretty much, yeah.
And so were queer and trans topics covered in other classes, other humanities and social science classes or otherwise?
Not really.
Like not history. Have you taken history classes?
I've taken American history, but nothing really.
Nothing in English.
No.
It's called beating a dead horse, which is a horrible saying.
Yeah.
Uh,
I guess not a lot of queer topics or anything have been brought up in any like English or English writing, philosophy, not really, communications, not really.
have you ever, like, does that surprise you? Did you ever have the expectation that queerness would ever be brought up in these other classes?
I guess I think that maybe this is my assumption of it, but I think that that topic maybe isn't brought up because of maybe how controversial it can be for some people, and not everybody can identify as with that. But I think it also shows like how it's not as important either, and how we don't teach people to be accepting of that as well. I think that like one thing I've seen in my communications class is like police brutality and like racism, but there's only so much you can do, and then it's like it becomes repetitive, and it is a problem, and I'm not gonna like downplay what the effects and everything of it, because it is horrible and it's an ongoing thing, but um, I think I'm just so used to not talking about it to where I guess I don't really notice it when it's not talked about. So I think when it does get brought up, then it kind of opens up my eyes, like, oh, we're actually talking about this. And I haven't really seen, like I said, I haven't seen much in any of my classes other than like queer people being in my classes, and that's pretty much it. And like hearing their perspectives on things. That's pretty much all I've been exposed to going to Sac City for the last 15 years.
Okay, so upon reflection, do you think, like, how important do you think it might be to include queer and trans topics in the course curriculum for queer folks to feel included and seen on campus?
I think it's important. Um, I think it's important because, um, you know, what is it? Inclusivity is like, it should be practiced more. I think we're doing a great job with acknowledging like different groups and clubs and stuff now. It's cool that we have a QSA here, Pride Center. I think it's but it's not big enough. I think that like maybe the funding and the amount of students isn't a good turnout, but for me, so last semester I signed up for Pride Center and QSA updates. There hasn't really been much. And when I go to the different like clubs that are over there in the, I think it's a student center, Rasa and the other group they're both downstairs, they have so many students that go in there. And there's way more students, there's more people to help them. And then when I went upstairs to, the Pride Center, they're sharing a space, a smaller space with the Asian Pacific Islander Center. And then I don't see that many people in there. I think they're also sharing it with Native American Center too. So it's like you're just bunched up into one, and it just kind of feels like a small group that isn't represented the way that I wish it was. And it's kind of discouraging to even try to go there because there's not really much, you know? Like if there were more counselors in there, uh, you know, more students getting involved because there is more stuff going on, that'd be really cool. I think I'd be more involved, but because it seems like a study hall in there all the time, like I don't ever really go in there. And it's kind of why I don't really support the Pride Center and the Asian Pacific Islanders Center as much because it's very limited and um, it's kind of like you're given you're given the basics, but you're not given like the rest of what other people have on campus.
Kind of out of the way too. It's kind of hard to find.
Yeah, I didn't know how to find it, and then somebody was like, "Oh yeah, it's upstairs," and I was like, "Oh well, it says API. Oh, that's where the Queer Center is too." And I was like, "I don't know, man. It's not really clear, but I wish it was like a little bit more easier easier, like more signs that said that where it's at, because I had to ask people how to get up there."
So, would you consider taking a course that focused entirely on queer and trans topics?
Um, uh, I would be down to take a class that covered queer and trans topics in depth because just covering an introductory is not enough, and that's where my mindset of I don't take that because I'm living it, you know. It's like you know. Being taught like about Asian culture and you know if somebody's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna show you how to cook rice. Well, I already know how to cook rice, right? I'm not getting anything out of it. So I think that's my approach right now because there's really not much of a selection of courses that deal with that.
I've heard other students say something similar, like, "Oh, intro to LGBTQ studies. That's going to be introductory, and I probably won't learn that much from an introductory class about LGBTQ studies."
Yeah.
Which, I mean, it does make sense, I think, to me in some ways because it's like younger people are finding so much information out through like the internet and through reading and pop culture and their friend group, right? So it's then you're like, you might think they're going into a classroom that's called Intro to LGBTQ Studies. If that's all that's offered, it might be too introductory.
Yeah.
And also, they don't, Intro to LGBTQ Studies is not really offered at the high school level, so it's not even legible for a lot of students. Like, what is that? What are we going to learn in that class? What does it mean to offer a course that's interdisciplinary like this, right?
Yeah.
So what about Asian American experiences in the classroom? You said you were learning about like police brutality and stuff. Have you like learned about like racism against Asian Americans or Asian American culture and history?
I think the only thing that really I've heard get brought up is about like the Asian hate that was going on during the pandemic. Um, but that's pretty much it. Like, that's another topic that I don't really think that gets talked about much. Um, there's and even in American history. I mean, they talk about like the immigration and a little bit of what Japanese Americans or Chinese Americans went through, but like the queer studies, like it's just an introductory, and I know they have like different um, history classes that like you know um, African American history, Chicano history, um, Asian American. I think that's great, but it kind of sucks when it has to be a history class that's like separate, because it just feels like like American history is like focused on white and black, which I mean it's a big part of it, but it's not everything.
So you mentioned that you have had some not students, faculty ask students to share their pronouns, and maybe have they also shared their pronouns, faculty?
I've only had a couple, um, and they were definitely younger professors. I haven't really experienced that with like professors that have been here for a while. So yeah, that's pretty much my experience with the pronouns.
Do you think it's important for faculty to ask about pronouns, to share their own pronouns?
I think it's important, at a personal level to know their pronouns, and also, um, having other students acknowledge, other people's pronouns that they prefer. Because um, I had a um, I had that teacher that said pronouns, um, later on, but the first class I took with her, she didn't establish that, and we had a trans student, and they had dealt with some of the students calling him she, and uh, and nobody was saying anything, and then he would have to defend himself and say, "I'm a he," and then people would be like, "Oh, I'm sorry," and to kind of cut that problem out, I think she approached it with, "Okay, everybody go around and say your pronouns," and that's when I was like, "Okay, this is better," because there was no problems during that semester when the pronouns were established.
So that professor did it after the fact, though, when they were like,
Yeah.
oh, I should have maybe done this earlier.
Yeah, but I think everything's just a learning experience, right? Like we wouldn't know things unless, well, at least for me, I'm a person that has to fall on their face in order to learn.
So how do you think faculty, staff, and students can learn to use the correct pronouns for people?
Well, I don't know about learning. um, I think it's kind of like the saying, you can, what is it? You can give water to a horse, but you can't make him drink it. I don't know how you say it, but
It's something like that.
and I think that's the same thing with the pronouns. Like people have choices, and I think it's I think it's just really important in general um, to have a kind of like a zero tolerance type of rule in class, like just so like boundaries are established with, like, if you don't like something, you can walk out of the room. You know, if you don't like somebody's pronouns, so that's kind of tough on you. And if you decide you are gonna go and do what you want, that's not going to be tolerated, because you're going to make somebody want to drop their class because they're going to feel excluded. And I think like having rules like that would help people feel a little bit more safer, um, and less awkward having to defend themselves.
Um, so is there anything else you want to say on the topic of pronouns?
Um, I would say it's nice to see in the last couple of years the the questioning of pronouns, especially like in questionnaires, or um, like a teacher asking or something. Like 15 years ago, Sac City, like that wouldn't have happened. um, you know, that kind of stuff's not established, and that's where those hangups occurred with people that were queer or trans that didn't identify with whatever was on the roster of their name or whatever. And I think for faculty, I think it'd be really an interesting approach to educate faculty on queer studies, because not everybody's going to understand what queer people have gone through. You know, like it's up to them to understand, but it'd be really cool for like the district to have like certain professors take certain courses to inform them of certain underrepresented groups, because you know I know that these professors have gotten the education that they have, but I don't know like if they've experienced the same things as their students have either, with trying to get an education, um, having to suffer financially during going to school, or having to um, hide their disability or hide their sexuality. Like some of these teachers probably have never gone through it, but I think teaching and having them understand, like, hey, these are the hangups that keep people from pursuing their education or continuing their education, um, would be a really good thing, because I mean we're in an educating space, right? And if they go their whole life like not really understanding what queer, disabled, or minorities go through, like what's the point of teaching if you're not teaching to everybody? You're just teaching to whatever demographic that you're comfortable with or you've grown up with, that you resonate with, right?
So, is there anything that you think the college could do better to make queer and trans students feel more included on campus in general?
I think one thing that um, I would say is like something I noticed at like hospitals is having like their IDs, like their badges. I don't know if they have badges or anything, but at the hospital that I went to, they had like a rainbow flag, and just I guess having like a queer flag or something like that basically says, you're safe talking to somebody, I think is a good like nonverbal way of saying, hey, you're in a safe space. I really do appreciate those stickers and flyers that are in front of like offices that say this is a safe space, but I think it'd be really interesting if we put that in all classrooms, to be honest, because there shouldn't just be specific spaces, right? Not just the counseling office or whatever. I think it's really important to kind of advocate that and say, this is a safe space. There's zero tolerance for discrimination. I think having signs posted like that would be some type of reassurance for some students that are not very verbal about speaking up for themselves.
So, is there anything else you want to add, or any other questions you want to return to?
I think going back to like what Sac City could do more for queer students to make them feel more welcomed and more safe. I think it would like to have more activities for queer students that are more um, queer like affiliated, I guess. Um, like it'd be really cool to, like for the school to have like a drag show and like everybody could go, right? And like not just it be like announced to the QSA. It'd be really cool to have like announcements throughout the whole school so like people that aren't just signed up for the Pride Center or whatever can be informed like, hey, because there's people that are questioning out there, but they want to be involved, but they don't really want to be involved, right? So I think that having things put out there um, to celebrate and liberate people would be really cool. Like it doesn't have to be um, like anything explicit or anything, right? But I think that's also like something that I've I've kind of had a problem with um, like the queer community, like is why I can go into depth with this, but why is it that like in Sacramento, why is it the gay places are bars? Why is there more bars? I mean, I know there's like a queer library, right? But like it's it's like drug affiliated, and like why not have things for people to look forward to rather than let me go to the bar, because that's where I ended up going when I was 18, was at the bar, because I was like, this is Lavender Heights in Sacramento, and this is where I feel safe because there's a safe space sticker on there. Nowhere else in Sacramento is really like that. And it's like I didn't really want to drink or anything like that, but it feels like you're not a part of something too when you're not really there for that purpose. And so I wish there was like more activities in general in Sacramento for for the queer community, and I think that it would be really good to have more activities for trans students to to do things out, events out in the open on campus. Like I said, the going to the center, it's upstairs, like in a hidden like corner, right? And that's not encouraging. Like if we had it like out where the fountains are, and everybody's gonna see that. And you know, on campus, we're supposed to be a safe space in general. So, um, it'd be good to have like the police, the campus police there or something, just as a reassurance that if it gets out of hand, that there is some type of support there too, so people aren't feeling like it's just vulnerability out in the open and anybody can do anything as well.
Okay, anything else you would like to add?
I think that's it.
Okay, well, thank you for taking all of this time. I really appreciate it.